Apology for Poetry by Philip Sidney. Now, most of us know Philip Sidney as maybe a poet, maybe a writer, but seldom few know him as a theorist or as a critic. Now, Sidney has written this essay, An Apology for Poetry, as a defense against certain attacks that came during his time against poetry. This essay that we are going to go through was written in 1580. It was republished in 1595, and the first edition was named as An Apology for Poetry, the title that we have with us, and the second edition was titled Defense of Poetry. Now you can see here the four main purposes of writing this essay. One, it was a persuasion in defense of poetry, because classical poetry was attacked by a person called Stephen Gosson and many others, out of which Stephen Gosson's was a popular one. It was termed as School of Abuse, which was published in 1578. He dedicated his essay to Sidney, and that is exactly why Sidney chose him and wrote Apology for Poetry as a defense to Gosson's School of Abuse. Also, it was an argument against the fact that poetry was full of blasphemy and it had immorality instilled in it, which would obviously misguide the layman. So, Apology for Poetry was actually Sidney creating a defense for poetry. It was also an assessment of the then available Elizabethan notions and poetic concepts. Now, if you see, the entire essay was divided into 5 parts. The first part was called as Exordium, which was introduction. Second was called as narration, which deals with the superiority of poetry. Third part of the essay is the preposition, wherein the writer deals with the center idea, the crux of the the story or the essay, and that is of course a defense against Gosson, a defense for poetry. And the fourth one is division, where in this part the main idea is being further analyzed with examples. And the fifth part was called as the confirmation. Of course, that's the conclusion of the entire essay, wherein it's a summary of the argument plus he tries to prove that poetry fulfills the end of humanistic education, which cannot be done even by philosophy or history, because at that point of time in the Elizabethan age and after that, philosophy and history were considered more scientific than poetry. Now, if you look at the major critical concepts that Sidney talks about in his essay, the first major concept that he talks about is the universality or the antiquity of poetry. So this is one defense that he creates for poetry to stand by its own. He says that poetry has preceded other branches of learning. Poets were initially called as the fathers of learning, and they have to be respected for their antiquity. They have been there for a long time. Sidney also says that philosophers and historians in the beginning appeared behind the mask of poets. So philosophers and historians at the beginning they portrayed themselves as poets. So according to him, Poetry is, of course, universal in the sense that it has flourished in all ages. An example, a very interesting example that he cites here is that even the hard-hearted Tusks and Tartars, their tribes, which can be seen in England, they love poetry, which actually softens their hard heart. So poetry is long-lasting and continuous. It's been there right from the beginning man existed in the history of the nation and lasts the longest. Even the Greeks and Romans, because that point of time English literature was slowly coming up, and they looked up to the Greeks and Romans because Greece and Rome were the center of knowledge then. So Sidney says that the Greeks and Romans too honored the poets. The poet truly a maker, it's a maker and not a slave of nature, which means the poet has the capacity and also has the freedom to make knowledge, rather than to be a slave of what already exists in the society. And that is why we quote Sidney's line here: nature's world is brazen, the poets only deliver a golden. So if the nature provides, if the society provides bronze, it's gold that the poets deliver. So poetry thus becomes a speaking picture of reality, and it has two purposes. One, of course, it teaches the audience, and two, it gives them delight. Next, he divides poetry into three major divisions. He says that poetry can be religious, which has a religious favor to it, which is used to either praise God or sing songs for God. Poetry can be philosophical, wherein abstract concepts are dealt with through poetry, through verses or through versification. And then he says there comes the third kind of poetry, the poetry that delights and teaches the readers, like the elegiac kind of poetry, the satiric poetry, the heroic poetry, the comic poetry, the epic poetry. So all these are different kinds of poetry which teaches and delights the audience. The third major point he talks about is he argues for the superiority of poetry to both history and philosophy. And these are the 4 points that he gives in connection to his argument. He says that philosophy presents mere abstract concepts that cannot be understood by the common man. On the other hand, history deals with concrete facts and examples, which is quite boring, and it's difficult to extract truth from it for a common man. Now he says poetry is a perfect blend of both history and philosophy. It teaches universal truths like philosophy, and it also gives you concrete examples like history, so that it is a perfect capsule that is given to the readers to follow. And thus he says poetry is surely superior to history and philosophy, and two, it teaches virtuous actions. So it teaches and delights. It does the work of philosophy and it does the work of history. It combines the goodness of philosophy and history, and it inspires people to follow it, which according to Sidney is the greatest defense against poetry. Next, he talks about the rhyme. He says that rhyme is not the only essence of poetry, but it is desirable to use it for the given reasons. He says that, of course, rhyme need not be kept away with. Rhyme can be used in poetry, and that rhyme actually polishes the verse or the speech in poetry. Scaliger, according to him, who was one of the greatest philosophers of the time, he too defended the use of rhyme. He too agreed that rhyme brings in a touch of um, a touch of um, you know greatness, a touch of vibrancy, a touch of difference in the verse. It regulates verbal harmony. It adds to the words the sensuousness, that's what we were talking about, and the emotional quality of music. And these, of course, attract the listeners. And thus, it helps to aid the memory of the readers. Readers can easily memorize verse, and thus they can take in very easily what the verse is talking about, or what the main theme of the verse is. So these are the 5 reasons that he says, or that he uses to tell the readers that rhyme is essential when you write a verse or when you write poetry. The 5th major concept he talks about is he answers several charges against poetry. And this given below are both the charges and also Sidney's answer to it. The first charge against poetry that Gosson talks about in his book is poetry is useless and it's a waste of time. So for this, Sidney's defense or answer or reply to this statement is, Sidney says that poetry is conducive to virtuous action. As we said before, poetry teaches and delights. It is superior to history and poetry. So he says that poetry can never be termed as useless. It actually inspires people to correct their actions, to become a good being. The second statement, or the second attack against poetry, was that poetry is the mother of lies. And to this, Sidney says that the reply that he gives is that the poet never affirms anything. He just mentions in his work, or he just gives out his idea into the work. He never affirms anything, and therefore he can never lie. For to lie is to affirm what is not true. So Sidney says that poetry, the fact in poetry is not the same as a fact in science. So you cannot compare poetry with the other subjects. It's not then all these subjects do not have the same framework. So poetry can never be termed as the mother of lies. 3. The third attack was that poetry has a corrupting influence, and it is infected with the theme of love. So it makes pestilent or dangerous desires in the minds of men. Now to this, Sidney answers that the fault lies not with poetry, but the contemporary abuse of poetry. So he says that it is not the fault of poetry itself, as an art, but it is a wrong use of poetry. It is the abuse of poetry, or it is actually producing substandard poetry that corrupts the mind of people who reads it. So it's not the mistake of the art, or it's not the problem. The problem is not with the art. The problem is with men who deal with it. The abuse of poetry should not lead to the condemnation of poetry. So don't condemn the craft itself. It is the craftsman who is spoiling the craft. The next point that he talks about in the essay is that contemporary English poetry and drama are on decline. This is what he says even in the last part, in the the former part of the essay, where he says that there is an abuse of poetry happening during that point of time when Sidney was alive, in the Elizabethan age. Now, he feels that these are the 6 reasons why drama and poetry could have declined in the Elizabethan period. One, there was no war happening during that time. There was no pain. There was no, there was no chaos happening in the society. So peaceful years bred sluggish generation. A lazy generation was being bred, and in such a generation where they don't have any challenges before them, where they don't go through pain or suffering, they become a lazy generation, and they are completely devoid of spirits, of ardent spirits or strong spirits for poetic creation. They are not inspired at all. Sidney affirms the fact that poetry does require genius, and that was lacking in their age. So that could be one reason why English poetry and drama declined in the Elizabethan period. There was also widespread ignorance about poetic art because other genres were trying to suppress poetry. Sidney's conception of tragedy is a mixture of medieval tradition and concept of Aristotle. He believed that a tragedy should show the fall of the tyrants. So Sidney looked up to the Greek masters when it came to the question of tragedy, of making a tragedy. He believed that the theme of tragedy should match with the plot, and if it is a tragedy, then it should be showing the fall of the tyrants, or maybe the fall of the hero. He also condemns modern tragedy for the incongruous mingling of tragic and comic elements. Incongruence means the illogical, without any logic, without any proper proportions. So modern tragedy is a mix of tragedy and comedy, and people are completely strayed away from the real motive of a tragedy. But on the other hand, he also agrees with the fact that mixing can be done. Tragic elements and comic elements can be mixed in a tragedy, but it is in rare circumstances. He also condemns the contemporary comedy, which according to him is a big farce, a big mask, because he says that even though it is comedy, it should be of an intellectual type. He carefully distinguishes between laughter and delight. He says that delight is more intellectual, it is more useful to the audience than laughter. Now, laughter can be produced even if someone tickles you. That's why he says that laughter is mere scornful tickling. Whereas to create delight or pleasure in the audience, you need a much higher level of thinking involved in it. So he says that contemporary love poetry, contemporary means in his age, was equally degenerated. It was below standard love poetry of his times. It was cold, unmoving, and the style was not unsuitable for the expression of passion. So he feels that these are the reasons why contemporary English poetry or poetry of his period and drama were had to go down in standards. At the end of the entire essay, he summarizes all the arguments again, and he concludes with these 4 points. He thus says that English language is very superior to all the other continental languages. This is his perspective, that it is fit for both quantitative and qualitative versification based on accent and rhyme. So he says that English language is the best language wherein you can put in qualitative versification. For example, there's a lot of figures of speech, accent, rhyme that can be put into this language. Plus, it can also be used for quantitative versification. Concepts and themes can be better put out or presented through English language. So according to Sidney, English language is much superior to the other continental languages because they had French and and German and many other languages, Italian, So when compared to all of them, according to Sidney, English language was superior. And the language also had a Caesar or a breathing space. So it was easy, or it was better for people to versify in English, because the rhyme and rhythm was in such a way that people could easily bring in their versification through English. And English was also capable of three kinds of accent and rhyme. There was a male accent, a female accent, and a dicular accent. So, in this respect, he says that English language was much superior to other languages. Thus, he says that the apology of poetry is not epoch making, but epoch marking. So, the last point is actually evaluation of Sidney's essay, wherein we can understand that the essay does not create an epoch in the history of um, you know criticism, but it marks a certain benchmark, or it marks a certain point in the history of criticism where, for the first time, like Aristotle, someone stands up for poetry, defends poetry, and Sidney takes one step forward uh, to defend poetry and to highlight the importance of the language, of the English language, which Aristotle did not do. So, in that way, if you see, Sidney's Apology of Poetry does mark an epoch, or does place a marking, places a marking in the history of criticism.